Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today. My name is Lydia Boss, and I'm here with my co-program manager, Luther Hughes. Today, we are thrilled to introduce you to Artist Trust's new Readiness and Resilience workshop series. And this series of 5 programs happening over the next several months is centered on resiliency and preparedness of artists in the face of adversity. We're grateful to be working in partnership with CERF Plus and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to build programming around these timely issues.
So throughout this program series, we'll cover a range of topics, including being ready for unexpected change, building resilience through community, and address how the current pandemic and racial injustices has shifted our thinking around readiness and resiliency. And today we have our guest, CERF Plus Education and Outreach Director, Carrie Cleveland, who will give us an intro on CERF Plus and how we come to think about readiness and resiliency, which is usually, of course, tied to natural and personal disasters. Hi, Carrie. Thanks for being with us today. I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you so much, Lydia and Luther, for making it possible to join in this kickoff of your series on resilience for artists. And I'm really excited to be here with you folks and get to talk about CERF Plus's work and some of the resources that we offer for artists and some of the lens through which we come at resilience and what that means and some of the ways that we think about that and address that through some of our work and some of the things that we share out with artists. And so I am going to switch things around, share my screen. So let me do the little tech dance as I shuffle things around. All right, seeing my screen, everyone good? Thumbs up? All right, excellent, thank you. So again, thanks for letting CERF Plus help kick this Readiness and Resilience series off. And I wanna echo Lydia and Luther's thanks to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. This partnership in working with Artist Trust came through a grant that CERF Plus received to work with organizations around the country to help build resilience in their communities with the artists they serve. And so we're partnering with both Artist Trust and the Arts Council of Greater Baton Rouge to really help them support their artists in building emergency resilience with that kind of combination mentality of, CERF Plus has been working in the emergency sphere for our entire existence, but as a national organization, we're not as rooted in community. And so we're really thankful for this opportunity and thankful for Artist Trust to be willing to dive into this with us to build resilience for artists in Washington State. And so I want to start this presentation by giving just sort of an overview of who CERF Plus is and how we came to be and why we're here talking about emergency resilience for artists. And I do want to first acknowledge that I am coming here from Montpelier, Vermont, which is the unceded land of the Wabanaki Confederacy and the Abenaki. And while CERF Plus's office is in Vermont, we are a national organization, and we were founded in the mid-'80s, 1985, by a group of artists who work in craft disciplines who found that when they were at craft shows, they were always passing the hat for a peer who had had a fire or a flood or an illness or an injury. And from that sort of, analog crowdfunding beginning, CERF Plus has grown into a national nonprofit with a founding mission in emergency relief for artists working in craft disciplines. And from that work, we've also grown to support artists throughout all stages of their career, whether in emergency or not, and work on a national level to strengthen the safety net for artists. We really strive to be a go-to organization for studio-based artists on readiness, with information and resources and educational programs. We have resources on studio safety, et cetera, that I'll dive into a little bit more. But then on the other side of that work is we work to be an advocate for artists. We work with both the general emergency management community and also the federal government to ensure that their programs include artists and other self-employed workers. And as you can imagine, that's been a heavy focus of our work during COVID-19. But to talk a little bit more about how some of that work takes shape. So CERF, that comes from our founding mission, the Craft Emergency Relief Fund. And so our Emergency Relief Fund, it's a grant of $3,000 for artists who work in craft disciplines such as metals, fiber, ceramics, wood, glass, etc., all across the United States and territories. And this is it's a rolling grant. It doesn't have deadlines. It's not based on any kind of membership requirement. And it's a grant that is generally administered within 2 weeks of receiving an application. It's usually much faster. And while we know that if someone has a really large scale emergency, like, their studio burns down, a grant of $3,000 won't make them whole, but the idea is that it's a rapid relief that can bridge the gap between, say, the emergency and an insurance payout or other forms of support coming in. And the criteria for it is pretty simple: artists working in craft discipline and career-threatening emergency. And we work pretty closely one-on-one with artists after these emergencies because we know that after an emergency, there's a lot going on, a lot to manage, and we try to keep this process as simple and kind of kind and artist-centered as possible, and not make it burdensome or cumbered down with requirements and other barriers. And then the other facet of our emergency relief work that we offer is we work with, say, show producers or suppliers or manufacturers to see if they might be willing to, say, donate a kiln, or if it's an artist who exhibits at, a show producer's particular show, if that show producer would be willing to donate, say, a booth to that artist, just to try to deepen the package of assistance that we can offer to artists. And then it's also helpful for those show producers, suppliers, et cetera, because since it's an artist they know that CERF Plus has worked with, they know that the aid is truly going to someone who needs it, and that we've already done the relationship building for them. And again, no deadline on this program, entire United States and territories. And then during COVID, we realized that, given the scope of need around the country, we needed to come up with an additional dedicated program because our emergency relief fund was never designed to respond to something as massive as loss of market. And that was the emergency during COVID, was loss of market. And so we had a COVID-19 emergency relief fund, and we're fundraising right now to do a round 4. So if you're experiencing ongoing food, medical, or housing need due to the pandemic, encourage you to connect with us at cerfplus.org. And this is a grant of $1,000, again, addressing dire housing, medical, or food insecurity due to the pandemic. We've run 3 cycles of that grant within the past year, delivering 888 grants totaling $888,000 to artists in 48 states, 3 territories, and in Washington, DC. And we try to keep this, again, really simple, don't want it to be burdensome for people. We just ask for a simple kind of description of your career as an artist working on craft discipline, 5 images of work, and just a brief explanation of financial need, and a pretty simple process. And again, looking to run a 4th cycle soon. So also please spread the word if you know of anyone else who might be in need of that form of assistance. Other ways that we've been responding to COVID is doing advocacy work around the various federal response and relief packages, advocating when the PPP loans were not really understanding or recognizing artists and other self-employed workers' income, helping to help shepherd that language and legislation so that artists could use their Schedule Cs and other tax forms that are different from other kinds of businesses that aren't run by individuals or self-employed workers. So then, out of this work that's really rooted in emergencies, CERF Plus had sort of realization after Hurricane Katrina and just seeing the widespread devastation there. And it's also an area of the country where there's a really dense population of artists, that we needed to be more proactive in supporting artists in taking measures to support their careers and build emergency resilience before something even happened. And so in those past 16 years, we've been working to develop new resources to support artists on emergency resilience. starting with our Studio Protector, which used to be a physical tool that artists could use to assess their emergency readiness, and now lives in an online hub, to legacy planning materials around looking at your studio space and having documentation around, how you want to categorize your work and how you want your work to live on, to studio safety. And when we talk about studio safety, it's not like granular, like how to use a circular saw really well, but looking at kind of big picture and how you can protect yourself in your work. We've done a lot of work on insurance and helping artists get coverage that meets their needs. We have a grant program that's designated for career protection and emergency preparedness measures. And then we also did a series of videos with Missy Graff Balone from Wellness for Makers around self-care and your studio practice. So everything from, if you have a practice that involves kind of sitting and leaning over equipment, say a loom, a bench, or just other physical structures that might have you arching or kind of curling your spine, how you can adjust that posture to take care of yourself in the practice and the practice of making your work. Or, if you have a practice that involves standing for long periods of time, how to hold your body, other ways to kind of support wrist and other parts of your body so that, you're taking care of yourself, which is, you're your biggest asset as an artist, and making sure that you're protecting yourself as you're making your work. And I want to talk a little bit more about some of these resources in a little more depth. And I want to just also point out as well that while our roots are working with artists and craft disciplines, most of our materials around emergency preparedness are really relevant far beyond that. Some of them and some of our language might be a little rooted in craft, but the principles and the techniques and the things that you can do and the takeaways are really applicable beyond discipline. So I know that I've been leaning a little heavily around craft in my language thus far. I just want to really point out that the resources I'm going to share and some of the things that you can use are applicable far beyond craft. So don't let that craft emergency relief fund route dissuade you or have you tune out. So first I want to talk about the Studio Protector. Like I said, its origins were a kind of physical tool that artists could use, but now it's all entirely an online hub through our website, cerfplus.org. And it really runs in the full cycle of thinking about emergencies and career resilience and building resilience and measures that you can take. In the Get Ready section, it talks about how to think through your practice as an artist and figure out what you want to do and what emergency resilience and kind of planning could mean for you, looking at your practice itself and what's important to you and what's vital and what you want to protect, and then thinking through kind of what kind of risks do I have, whether they're based on where I live, do I live in an earthquake prone area? Do I work with materials that are dangerous? Do I work in a building where other people's practices might have an impact on mine? And thinking through just kind of what are the things that I'm vulnerable to based on my particular circumstance. And then that kind of helps you figure out too, where you want to go and what you want to focus on in building your resilience. So it has that kind of process built into. It also has really simple, actionable things that you can start to take on. For example, if you need to implement inventory systems around your artistic practice, there are downloadable tools and templates to get you started. If you're looking for kind of a really robust, like out of the box, like database online kind of system, there are suggestions of places that you can look to find one of those. There are also some resources and guidance around types of documentation you want to keep for your creative practice, and then beyond the what you might want to keep and how you want to think about storing it. So say if you have things that are only in hard copy that could be vulnerable, start thinking about how else you could store them. Just a really clear example that I always think back to around the importance of that I learned through our emergency relief work when I started at CERF Plus a long time ago, and was wrapping my head around what emergency kind of resilience and steps you could take would look like specific to an artist practice. I think about someone who applied for assistance after her studio flooded, was a wide-scale river flood in her area. And she's a ceramic artist who, throughout her career, had been developing a suite of glaze formulas. And she kept those in a binder in her studio. And then when her studio flooded, that suite of formulas was gone in an instant. And so that, kind of clarified for me, like, oh, that's the kind of thing you need to be looking at ahead of time. Because I think we all in our way, in our lives, both in our artistic practices and outside, we all have that suite of glaze formulas, that thing that's really vital, that we could be taking measures to start to protect. And then the studio protector, does move through, if you do have an emergency, what kind of steps you should take in terms of accessing relief from other providers, and accessing help from within your community. And then there's also a bunch of information on kind of helping yourself after an emergency. And while some of that is rooted more in emergencies that have physical manifestations, with resources on things like salvage or how to assess damaged spaces and making sure that you're caring for yourself within that process, it also talks about self-care and emotional recovery from emergencies and creating space within yourself to be able to create your work again. There are also tips on crowdfunding and working with volunteers. So it really tries to think about the full kind of arc of what it means to think about resilience and shoring and seeding that within a career. And then the Get Ready grant program that we offer, it's grants of up to $500 to take some kind of career protection or studio safety or emergency preparedness measures. And that can look like a lot of different things. Some of them are really logistic around caring for your health and your safety within a practice, like improving ventilation. It could be instituting better documentation practices for your career. Maybe you need additional software to support you in doing that. Maybe you need to hire someone to help you. Maybe it's just really not your forte, and you need some support in that work. Or maybe you work in materials that are really valuable and you feel like you need to shore up your actual physical security setup and structures within your practice. Or could be making infrastructure changes if you have identified, like, okay, so I am in an area that's vulnerable to, say, earthquakes, and there are some really physical infrastructure changes that I need to make to help protect my space, protect my work, protect my practice. Grants can be used for those, or just creating better systems for storing your work safely, or even moving it around your studio safely if you're prone to back strain based on the weight of the work that you're making and having to move it around. You need to build better systems into your practice to support your physical health. The Get Ready grants can be used for that as well. We also have an insurance hub through our site. CERF Plus has done a lot of work on advocacy around insurance too, to make sure that insurance providers understand artist practices. And so, say, if an artist who works in ceramics goes to get a quote, that provider isn't equating them with like a large scale ceramics manufacturer and offering them this wildly unreasonable, unfeasible, and untenable plan. So we have a business insurance guidebook for artists that's downloadable from our website that talks through, what to think about in going into insurance. And if I was losing you when I was talking about inventory earlier, this is where something like inventory comes in handy. Knowing what you have is really vital to knowing what you need to get coverage for, accessing insurance. And it talks about different types to think about, a business plan and liability plans, and then also thinking about, if you need kind of event-based coverage, the things to think about, and then also how to kind of think about getting started and finding insurance if that's something new that you're just adding to your artistic practice. Again, having that inventory and having a really solid picture of what you need coverage for. And then also things like thinking about writing a business commentary, which is just a simple 2-page narrative that outlines your creative practice, so that when you go to talk to a provider, you can give a really clear picture of your work, how you make your work, how you're running your business, so that you can go in prepared to feel like you're really conveying what you need to get across, to get coverage that you need. And we also have listings of insurance providers who work specifically with artists and understand artists' careers and have plans that are more tailored to an artist practice than kind of a generic insurance carrier provider. And we also have some resources on very specific types of coverage, like flood insurance and the National Flood Insurance Program and what it covers and what it doesn't. I also want to highlight our studio safety guide. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, this isn't going into, how to run a saw safely or things, really granular on that nature. It's more kind of looking at the big picture. If you're going into a space, looking at renting a studio for the first time, where you need to improve your current studio, thinking through kind of the overall structure and components and, kind of electrical load needs and hazardous materials and kind of the basic things that you want to think about. And I'll call out several examples from that. So, just basic ones like, are your art supplies even allowed in the building or the space? Are there rules around what's permitted and usable within the particular structure you might be looking at? Then conversely, was that studio or building designed as an artist space? And if it wasn't, was it something before that might prevent a health hazard? I think of all the old kind of factory buildings that converted. Some are converted well, some are not converted well, and just having an understanding of what is the space and could the space present a health hazard to me. Thinking through if it's a shared studio space, what are other occupants in there doing? Are they being safe as well? Is there anything and how other people are using the space that could present a hazard to me? And then are they even further in that? Are they using hazardous materials and are they doing it safely? And so just kind of being aware of what could be an issue for you just based on what other people in a space are doing. If you use hazardous chemicals in your practice, do you have copies of the safety data sheets for each of those chemicals? If you Google safety data sheets, there are plenty of databases where you can download those SDS sheets really easily, just so you have the resource at your fingertips to make sure you know that you're doing everything you need to for properly storing and handling those materials. And then basic safety, do you have a plan posted for routes to leave the studio building in case of fire or other emergency, knowing that there's kind of clear egress ways to get out. And it's also really important too, if you're bringing other people into the space, students, studio visits, et cetera, just to have, those basic safety components really lined up and clear from the beginning. So I want to kind of pivot now after grounding in our resources a little bit and talk about overall resilience in light of artistic practices, to kind of help in framing how you might want to engage with some of our resources from the lens of your own practice. And our resources were really grown out of the understanding we've gained through our work with individual artists after emergencies and the particular challenges that they face in career resilience. It's also an opportunity as we're maybe, possibly, hopefully coming to something approximating the end of this pandemic to think about challenges you might have faced over the past year and a half and things that you were working to put in place in real time in response and what you learned. And so some of the challenges that we've seen after emergencies working with artists, obviously, clearly this was the key one too with the pandemic, challenges in accessing sales or income or how you normally might make a living through a creative practice being disrupted through an emergency. Or maybe you don't have access to a studio space or a practice space, or that space was damaged and is currently unusable, just physically inaccessible. Accessing insurance. I want to flag that more often than not, especially if you're working in your home or have a studio in your home, homeowners and renters insurance almost never covers business losses for artists. If you have a homeowners or renters policy that says that it does, get real clarity on that. I would just add that tip. We've unfortunately heard from people who were told, oh, sure, your studio's covered, and then it wasn't. So a note of caution there. Finances, having the financial wherewithal to weather an emergency, having reserves, often really just not something that's in place, and it's hard to keep in place. Having documentation of your practice. I think about the past year and a half and all the grant opportunities that came up, or the federal relief, and having the paperwork and documentation ready to go at your fingertips to apply for some of those relief packages, etc. And also too, after emergencies, sometimes it's just not physically available, or you have to be out of a studio where there are things that you need, and they're only in that studio. Not having access, that can be a barrier towards moving forward and getting assistance and getting help and starting to recover. Again, having solid understanding of what you have and what potential losses might be. Damage to tools, equipment, and supplies, or inability to access them, inability to acquire them, can really slow down work in moving forward after an emergency. Having resources, yes, I think about after the pandemic, so many grant opportunities sprang up, but you have to know that they're available. And so, having that connection point to know what's, can help you in your resilience, what can support you, whether it's beforehand, some of the resources that we have, or after an emergency happens. And then also having a supportive network and community and having access to that. And I mean, we've just come out of a period of tremendous isolation. So as evidenced through us gathering here on Zoom, also tremendous opportunity to build network and build community and have that as a form of support and resilience moving forward. I think too, in challenges to career resilience, and something that's come up through a lot of conversations during the pandemic and during the challenges that it's brought up, is emotional reserves and mental space needed to engage in a creative practice, and how derailing emergency situations can be to those, and having resilience, and how to have those stores that you would need to even kind of move forward and begin making work again. And so I invite you to take a second and think about what being ready and being resilient as an artist might mean to you. And some ways that you can frame that and think about it are, how can you prepare your business, your career, artistic practice to recover from an emergency or unexpected instability? And if things are coming to you as I share these, feel free to drop them in the chat. Can you identify any measures, steps you can take now or over the next several months to protect yourself and your practice, or just even deepen resilience, or address something that's coming up for you to help see kind of resilience in the future or in the face of emergencies or instabilities? And then, what does resiliency mean to you in your artistic practice and in your community? Because artistic practices, maybe you work primarily in community too, and also community. I've just heard from so many people after emergencies, it's community that supports them through the emergency, and then they turn around and then support their community too, and it's such a mutual reciprocal relationship. And so what does resiliency mean to you and your kind of your own community and network? And I want to share some examples of how that resilience is real. We follow up with the artists we worked with through the Emergency Relief Fund to hear from them how an emergency has affected their practice. And of the artists we work with, for example, whose emergencies were rooted in illness or injuries, nearly 100% of them planned to continue their work. Their emergency wasn't going to stop them. And over half of them were making adjustments to their practice after their emergency to support their health, make changes, and take and see kind of health resilience into their artistic practice as a response to the emergency that they experienced. And then we also asked artists if they made changes to their work in response to their emergency, if it impacted, how they make their work or how they think about their practice going forward. And nearly 70% made changes to their artistic practice as a response to their emergency. And then we heard periodically that, in a way, the experience of looking back at their emergency, artists were reflecting that the changes they made, not only that they made them, but they'd had real positive impact on their emergency. And actually over half reflected back afterwards that their emergency did have a positive effect on their work, whether it inspired them to go in new directions or inspired them to make changes to health and safety, or just other kind of physical structures in their studio, practices, how they engage with their work. Over half had reported back that the emergency did kind of have a positive effect on their overall trajectory as an artist. And then, lastly, we ask artists, based on their experience, how they feel about the possibility, further emergencies, in the light of, do they feel more prepared based on what they've learned from their experience, kind of less prepared, and 3/4 of them felt at least somewhat, if not more prepared for future emergencies based on their experience of the one that they had already been through. And so I'm going to jump back to the opposite direction a little bit and introduce the readiness piece of readiness and resilience, from back to the vantage point of not having come at it through going through an emergency, and just want to set some kind of grounding definitions. Or is ready, in a suitable state for an activity, action, or situation, fully prepared, and resilient, the ability or power to return to an original state, or if that original state isn't available, just can't go back there, an ability to recover or adjust easily to adversity or change. And so, some ways to think about being more ready and resilient and having a more sustainable career is moving forward, thinking about how you will incorporate readiness into your artistic practice, what that means for you, whether you're thinking, okay, I need to improve air quality systems for how I make my work, or, I have been storing my work and images of it might work in a mixture of old slides from early in my career to I have physical photos of work, and then I have images in the cloud, and kind of getting a more consolidated, incorporated, concise system and practice, or otherwise thinking, okay, the studio space really isn't meeting my needs, my work practice space. I need to start looking into finding another space that is more suitable, less risk creating for me and for my practice. And kind of thinking along those lines, thinking about awareness of what unsafe conditions might be presenting themselves based on your current practice. Again, whether it's materials you use, it's the space you're in, just thinking about what unsafe conditions might be present for you and how you can avoid those. Accessing resources. You already are connected to tremendous ones. You're here through Artist Trust, and Artist Trust is a huge resource for artists. So you already are well connected there. I would encourage you, if you're interested, to sign up for CERF Plus's communications. There's on our website, cerfplus.org. At the bottom of each page, there's a red Get Connected box. We send out regular communications, sharing resources, whether they're things we're developing or we're producing, or if we know of another organization that's developed a really incredible resource for artists, we share those out widely, just helping, as that safety net ethic to help connect people to what's available, make sure people are aware and have access. And then developing, maintaining a supportive network. So many times after emergencies, we've heard from people that what really helped them in processing and getting through was their connection to community, whether that's community right in their physical geographic area, or say if it was an artist who works in ceramics, their connection to their field really helped them recover from their emergency. And then lastly, of course, taking care of yourself. Like I was saying earlier, you are your biggest asset as an artist. And so just making sure that you're really centering yourself. And I'll refer back to those Wellness for Makers video series that we did, looking at those as a way of also just kind of taking care of your physical body as you're making work as an artist. And so I want to kind of wrap this up a little by sharing some reflections from some artists that we know who've engaged with various facets of CERF Plus's work, and kind of steps they took or they've taken, or things that they've thought about as they've engaged with emergencies, whether on the getting ready side or the responding to something that happened side. This is Samiko Harrington, who's a textile artist who had studio damage after Hurricane Irma, and she really reflected that she wanted to move forward out of the emergency experience by setting really solid business practices, especially around her intellectual property and assets, and just really wanted to focus in on solidifying the business practice of her artistic career as a way to kind of move forward and build resilience as she recovered from Hurricane Irma. And then this is Erin Paganini, Washington State artist. And Erin was featured in this month's issue of Sunshine Artist magazine. And he's an artist who works in found objects and recovered objects, and produces sculptures and installations and collages and site-specific works. And he reflected that after his experience with COVID-19, he's not going to be changing how he does things, but he's looking at what he does come under a new lens. And he shared that this is his, these are his words, that the events are manifesting today in this world. They're a great possibility to grow, and that there's much more to learn from the challenges than the comfort zone, but it requires us to be flexible, take off our masks, and live in an honest and awake mode. Things don't change, they naturally evolve under different life scenarios. So really looking at kind of using this experience as a way to move forward and working with it. And this is Esther Irvin. She's a Get Ready grant recipient. She's a jewelry artist. And she, had noticed that she was really particularly sensitive to some of the fumes and other chemicals that she was using in her practice. So she got a Get Ready grant from CERF Plus to improve the ventilation system in her studio, and had a really interesting process for that, where things didn't go as planned. She had planned to use one kind of valve system, but they were really impossible to operate, and found a workaround and found another process. And also it just got her thinking about safety across all of her systems, because the new kind of workaround that she found had terrible smelling chemicals. She had to be putting it together outside, and just made her kind of more conscious throughout her practice too, of all the ways that she needed to be taking care of her health, and doing more research. And she called it, the whole experience consciousness raising, and more. She's also more aware of the safety of other individuals who might come into her studio, and making sure that she always has full safety gear for everyone, and masks and gloves. And just it's carried over just into her kind of looking at her practice from a preparedness safety lens moving forward. And then the last artist I'm going to share, the Erin Gallagher, is in Seattle, and she had moved into a new studio and had a theft, And after, she kind of gotten her, as she says, the dust settled after that experience, she was really committed to sharing it out and what she learned moving forward, so that others, can kind of get the value of her experience. And she wants to support other people in taking measures. And she's really, really committed to insurance, and really a champion for people having the right insurance for their practice. And she also talked a lot about photographing your studio and possessions, and that's a great tool too for helping to document loss if you're not ready to take on a spreadsheet or data bank inventory, just some kind of record that shows what you have. She talked about how she'd been collecting tools and stones and materials for the last 15 or 20 years, and just not being able to demonstrate that after a theft. And she also, I'll just add a caveat from her that is interesting, and something I hadn't known about, that not all safes are created equal. And we have the resources on this on our website if you're interested in looking into it a little deeper. She got really deep into rating systems on safes, and how to make sure that if you have a safe, it's something that's actually going to do the job it's designed to do and help protect you. And she also is a big advocate now for getting an alarm for studios. And so I'm thinking how to kind of tie all of this up. I acknowledge that I bounced a little back and forth between the experience of emergency and resilience afterwards, and then readiness, and sort of in a non-linear fashion. And that wasn't entirely without intention. Thinking about moving forward and seeding resilience in your career, it's inevitably going to be infused with and informed by the things that, say, you've learned over the past year and a half during the pandemic, the challenges, the successes, the connection points that ease some of those challenges and facilitated some of those successes. And so my hope is that you'll consider CERF Plus a resource and partner in continuing to build your own resilience moving forward. And so I know that I just bounced through a lot of kind of divergent information. So I want to open things up to some questions. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen so I can see all of your faces again.
Thank you so much, Carrie. We had some questions come in during the presentation, and so I'll just ask those questions here. Hello, Carrie. So I'm an advocate in mental health for creative people in Hong Kong. I'm interested in getting to know more about how you, CERF Plus, first started, especially in terms of how funds were gathered at the beginning. How did CERF Plus begin driving the awareness of artists' career to funding bodies and other supporting bodies? As I'm trying to kickstart mental health programs in Hong Kong, but I haven't been able to find much support to begin.
Yeah, thank you for that question, and thank you for taking on that work. I'm excited to hear about that project. So CERF Plus in its beginnings, it was really kind of self-funded by the people it was supporting, and that it was founded by a group of craft artists, and so basically it was everyone pooling money together. When I said passing the hat, I mean really literally, it was like people passing a hat at a show. And thinking about how we were able to move forward to where we are now, it's figuring out who's interested in that work and going to them. Our donor base kind of grew from the artists themselves to the galleries they work with, to the suppliers they buy from, to the show producers they exhibit at, and then once that started to build momentum, then we could start going to bigger funders, because you have to, donors, I think often at that larger funder level, want to see that there's a base of interest going in. And so, any way that within the communities you're working with, any way you can start to build a little momentum around gathering funds, just the more you can be able to demonstrate there's already people invested in interest in that, you start to have a snowball effect. Not sure if that fully answers your question, but I think like anything you can do to start building momentum, that will help you kind of keep it moving. Luther, you're muted.
Yes, my computer told me. Another question from the chat that came through during the presentation. Carrie, I have an insurance question. I'm on the leadership team of Partners in Print, an arts organization born during the pandemic for a private schools program which lost its studio space. We're without a central space for the foreseeable future, and so our printing equipment is temporarily housed by home-owning members of our team. Any advice on how an organization can successfully acquire insurance for both the equipment and those using it? And what about equipment that travels to special events like tabling at a farmer's market?
Yeah, I would say that's where going to an insurance company that's used to working with artists is helpful. And I'm going to make sure our website lands in the chat because we have a link to the Insurance Hub from the Get Ready link on our homepage. There are insurance policies that do understand things that have to travel from site to site. That's not uncommon in the arts. So I don't think that would be, I don't see that as being necessarily a barrier. So yeah, getting equipment for, so there's the equipment itself. So that's kind of the business policy side of things, and those using it more the liability side of things. And so, yeah, just making sure that when you're talking to insurers that you're asking about both that, like the coverage for, you're owning the things, and then making sure like liability is getting folded into.
Thank you. And I'll take a look at the link that you sent so that I can dig deeper into the resources that you have.
Are there other questions? You can feel free to either put them in the chat or even come off of mute and ask out loud if you have them. We have several more, we have a few more minutes before the time is done.
I wanted to share something about Artist Trust for Amy with your insurance question. We actually have a resource on our website that's about insuring public art, and that's different than what you're talking about, but something that I learned through going through the process of educating myself about artist insurance was that when talking to an insurance agent, there are some kind of key talking points that can help you to communicate really clearly, because I think, being an artist and working in our studios and working in our communities is kind of on like the opposite end of a professional spectrum than an insurance agency, right? They're two pretty different worlds. And so we actually have some language available to help to kind of guide that conversation and try to create some clarity around your asks as an individual that can help the insurance agent kind of find their footing in the conversation with you and vice versa. I am going to take a second to find that link and I'll drop it in the chat.
Great, thank you, Lydia.
I can shuffle awkwardly if it breaks the ice to, make anyone want to ask a question. Yes,
Yeah.
easy.
I just unmuted myself. Can you hear me okay? So as a newbie, it's kind of blowing my mind that there's all of these things to think about when actually starting a practice. Right now, my space is at home, And so I was just wondering about where you would start to go with finding an insurance that covers your home space. If you just have some main information about that, or
Yeah, do you mean, just to clarify a little, do you mean more about kind of thinking about going into conversations, or even about or just like finding providers?
like finding, I think just getting into the conversation of it, because I don't even have home insurance for, you know, my bigger house. And so actually starting to think of like, well, yeah, I work with metals and gemstones and different things like that. And so that can get expensive. And even thinking about what would happen if something happened to my stuff is kind of like, oh, yeah, that's something to to think about. Kind of blowing my mind a little bit. So I'm like, oh, okay, these are things like I just thought about. I should really write down all the stuff I have, you know, and just the fact that like you guys are like, yes, we've thought about these things, and you know, we have a database for this, and so just if you were to even start to look for insurance for your home space, for your art practice, what would that even look like?
Okay, one, like I hear the blowing your mind part. So one, don't get overwhelmed. Like this is totally doable. Two, you're on the right track with starting to make a list of what you have. Because you know, I again, you know, knowing what you have helps you know what you need to get insured. So just getting kind of really clear, kind of like, this is, you know, my kind of basic inventory. These are my tools. You don't need to be super granular, but just being able to paint a picture at least of what it is that you have. And then in terms of, you know, talking to providers, you can also just start kind of having the conversations, getting quotes, and it can be a generative process too, little, you know, they might have questions, you know, like that push a little further about, you know, what your coverage is, or, you know, how you're running your practice. And, you know, I encourage to also kind of follow your gut in talking to insurance providers too. Like if you feel like you're getting a runaround, or like, and feel free to go in with like a ton of questions. And if you feel like you're not getting those answered, you know, you're under no obligation to buy insurance from that provider. Like always keeping that mindset too. You know, it's your choice. And if there's something in particular too, like you're really concerned about making sure that, you know, your inventory of metals is covered, but you feel like you're not getting great answers to those questions, or they're not able to kind of tell you about how that's covered in your policy. Just like I have a real strong belief in trusting your gut around those conversations too. Yep. And again, I'll say we do have, you know, insurance providers who work with artists on our site too, just, you know, so you don't feel like you're having to cold call companies that may have no idea what you're talking about when you're talking about like working as an artist. Like, like metals, like what? Like, are you a miner? Like,
yeah. Okay. Thank you. I actually do have one more question if nobody has a question. So being a newbie, as I'm working with some of my wire, like I'll have a thought like, is working with this kind of metal toxic for my bare hands? You know, and I try to look up all these classes online, different things like that. I was wondering, do you guys have classes about working with certain kind of materials?
Yeah, we don't around medium specific things like that, but definitely check in with the Society for North American Goldsmiths.
Oh, sweet, thank you.
They have an offshoot program, and the name's escaping me right now, but they talk about like, you know, environmentally conscious materials, and also like they're just a good resource to go to for that more kind of technical around the making of the work piece and safety.
And that's it.
Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Carrie, of course, for the first of our 5-part program series on readiness and resilience. Our second event, which will be happening in late July, will be a community conversation between Washington State artists and other orgs possibly about the current pandemic and racial injustices and how that has shifted our idea of readiness and resiliency in the art sphere and the art world.
Yeah, please keep an eye on our social media channels, and we encourage you to sign up for our monthly newsletter if you're not already. And those are great places to keep an eye out for forthcoming details and dates. Carrie, thanks again for all of your work with artists and for your presentation today. It was awesome.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.